The seamstress hunched over her work table in the back room of Murphy's General Store, squinting hard at the needle she'd been threading for the past 5 minutes, willing her eyes to cooperate just one more time before the afternoon light faded completely. Annabelle Bishop had noticed the blurriness creeping in 6 months ago, but admitting weakness meant losing the one job keeping her fed in this dusty corner of Humboldt, Nevada, and at 23 years old with no family and fewer prospects, she couldn't afford that luxury. The year was 1882, and women who couldn't pull their weight didn't last long in mining towns like this one. She finally managed to thread the needle and began stitching the torn work shirt laid out before her, bringing the fabric so close to her face that she could smell the sweat and copper dust embedded in its fibers. Her eyes watered from the strain, but she kept going, her fingers working mostly by feel now, tracing the tier with practiced precision even as the world around her dissolved into shapes and shadows. "Miss Bishop?" The voice of Samuel Murphy, the store owner, drifted through from the front. "Got another stack of mending here when you're ready." "Just finishing this one up, Mr. Murphy," she called back, keeping her voice steady and cheerful despite the headache blooming behind her eyes. She tied off the thread and held the shirt at arm's length, trying to inspect her work, but the stitches were just dark lines against lighter fabric now. She ran her fingers along the seam instead, feeling for any gaps or puckers. Satisfied, she stood and carried it to the front counter, navigating around the barrels and crates more by memory than sight. Mr. Murphy was helping a customer, a tall man in dusty riding clothes with his back to her. She set the shirt on the counter and reached for the new pile of mending, her hand brushing against something that felt like paper. "Those came in on yesterday's mail wagon," Mr. Murphy said, nodding toward the envelopes. "For you." Annabelle's heart quickened as she picked up the letters, holding them close enough to make out the return addresses. One from her cousin in San Francisco, another from a fabric supplier in Carson City. She'd need to read them soon, while she still could make out the words in good light. "Thank you," she said, tucking them into her apron pocket. "I'll have these shirts done by tomorrow afternoon." "No rush," Mr. Murphy said kindly. He was a good man, patient with her increasingly slow pace, though she knew his charity wouldn't last forever. "Miss Bishop does the finest needlework in Humboldt," he added to his customer. "These shirts will look good as new." The tall man turned slightly, and Annabelle caught an impression of dark hair and sun-weathered skin before her vision blurred again. She nodded politely in his direction and retreated to her workroom, anxious to sit down before the dizziness hit. It had been happening more frequently lately, her body's protest against the constant eye strain. Back at her table, she pulled out the letters and held them under the window where the light was strongest. Her cousin's familiar handwriting swam before her eyes, the individual words impossible to distinguish. Panic rose in her throat. Yesterday, she'd still been able to make out most of the words if she tried hard enough. Today, there was nothing but meaningless scribbles. She set the letters aside with trembling hands and picked up the next shirt from the mending pile, feeling for tears or missing buttons. This one needed a button replaced. She could do that. She'd memorized the location of everything in her button tin, organized by size and color through hours of patient sorting. The afternoon wore on and Annabelle worked steadily, her fingers compensating for what her eyes could no longer do. She heard customers coming and going in the front of the store, the low rumble of men's voices mixing with Mr. Murphy's cheerful greetings. The mining operations had been good lately, bringing more men to town and more work for everyone. She should be grateful for the business. As the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the room in shades of orange she could only perceive as lighter and darker grays, Annabelle packed up her work and gathered the unread letters. She'd have to ask someone to read them to her, a humiliation she'd been dreading but could no longer avoid. "Good night, Mr. Murphy," she called, making her way carefully toward the front door. "Night, Miss Bishop. Mind how you go." The walk to her boarding house was 6 blocks, a route she'd walked hundreds of times. She counted her steps, used the sounds and smells as guideposts. The blacksmith's forge, the saloon with its piano music, Mrs. Chen's laundry with its soap and starch scent. The world was still there, just painted in increasingly abstract strokes. She was fumbling with the gate to her boarding house when a voice spoke beside her, making her jump. "Let me get that for you, miss." The same deep voice from the general store, she realized. The tall man with Mr. Murphy. "Thank you," she said, stepping through the gate he'd opened, careful to keep her chin up and her gaze forward as though she could see perfectly well. "You dropped this." He pressed a piece of paper into her hand. One of her letters must have slipped from her pocket. Heat rushed to her face. "Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you again, mister." "Jackson, Matthew Jackson. I'm new in town, working at the Silver Star Mine." "Welcome to Humboldt, Mr. Jackson. If you'll excuse me." She hurried up the path to the front door, counting steps, reaching for the railing she knew would be there. Inside the boarding house, she sagged against the wall, her heart racing. She hated this, hated the constant vigilance required to appear normal, to keep anyone from discovering her secret. That night she lay in bed holding the unread letters, tears of frustration leaking from her useless eyes. She'd taught herself to read at 14, had loved nothing more than losing herself in the worlds contained in books and letters. Now that world was closing, fading to gray, and she didn't know how to stop it. The next morning Annabelle woke early and dressed by feel, choosing clothes from the left side of her wardrobe where she kept her work dresses arranged by fabric weight. She braided her hair without a mirror, fingers finding the familiar pattern, and made her way downstairs to the dining room where Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house owner, served breakfast. "Morning, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, and Annabelle followed her voice to an empty chair. "Biscuits and gravy today." Annabelle ate carefully, locating each item on her plate and cutting her food into small, manageable pieces. Another boarder, Miss Stevens, the school teacher, chattered about something happening at the school, but Annabelle only half listened, her mind on the letters still upstairs and the question of who she could trust to read them. She arrived at Murphy's general store just as Mr. Murphy was unlocking the front door. Her workroom smelled of dust and fabric sizing, comforting in its familiarity. She settled at her table and pulled out the first shirt from yesterday's pile, a work shirt with a torn sleeve that needed patching. An hour into her work, Mr. Murphy appeared in the doorway. "Miss Bishop, there's a gentleman here asking if you might help him with something. He needs a letter written." Annabelle's hands stilled on the fabric. "A letter?" "Says his handwriting's too poor for the lady he wants to write to. Wondered if you'd write it out for him, his words in your hand. He'll pay, of course." It was a common enough request. Many men in mining towns had little education, their hands better suited to picks and shovels than pens. Before her vision had deteriorated, Annabelle had often served as a scribe for a few cents per letter. "Of course," she said, because she couldn't think of a reason to refuse without raising suspicion. "Send him back." She heard heavy footsteps, and then that same deep voice from yesterday. "Miss Bishop, I appreciate your help." Matthew Jackson, the man from the store, from her gate. "Please sit," she said, gesturing to the stool across from her table. She pulled out a sheet of writing paper and her pen, praying her hands wouldn't shake, that she could manage this one last time through memory and touch alone. She'd written hundreds of letters. Surely she could do one more. "Who is the letter for, Mr. Jackson?" "My sister Ruth, back in Colorado. I promised I'd write once I got settled somewhere." Relief flooded through her. A letter to a sister. Nothing romantic that would require flowery language or careful phrasing. "What would you like to tell her?" He spoke slowly, his words simple and direct. He told Ruth about his journey to Nevada, about the job at the Silver Star Mine, about the room he'd found at a boarding house on the east side of town. Annabelle's pen moved across the paper, forming letters she couldn't see, spacing words by feel and years of practice. Her penmanship had always been excellent, praised by the teacher who'd first taught her to write. She could only hope muscle memory would serve her now. When he finished, she signed his name as he spelled it out, then carefully folded the letter and handed it to him. "That's beautiful writing," he said, and there was surprise in his voice. "Ruth will be impressed." "Thank you," Annabelle said softly. That will be 5 cents. He placed the coin on the table and she heard him stand, but he didn't leave immediately. Miss Bishop, I wonder if I might impose on you for one more thing. I received a letter from Ruth yesterday, and I'm not much for reading either. Would you be willing to read it to me? I'll pay, of course. The request hit her like a physical blow. Of course he would need this. And she couldn't do it. Couldn't even see the paper in front of her well enough to thread a needle anymore, let alone read someone else's handwriting. I'm afraid I'm very busy with mending today, she began. But he interrupted gently. It would only take a moment. I'll pay 10 cents. 10 cents. That was good money for a few minutes of work, money she desperately needed as her sewing grew slower and more uncertain. But she couldn't do it. She opened her mouth to refuse again, but what came out instead was, "May I see the letter?" He placed it on the table before her, and she picked it up, holding it at various distances, trying to find an angle where the words might come into focus. Nothing. Just blurred shapes on white paper. Her throat tightened. Mr. Jackson, I'm afraid I have a terrible headache today. The light is bothering my eyes. Perhaps if you could come back tomorrow when I'm feeling better? There was a pause, and she felt his attention on her, assessing. When he spoke, his voice was careful, gentle. Of course. I'm sorry to hear you're not feeling well. I hope you feel better soon. After he left, Annabelle sat motionless, the letter still in her hands. She'd bought herself one day to figure out what to do. That evening, she made a decision. She would have to tell someone the truth, but carefully, strategically. She needed someone who wouldn't spread gossip, who wouldn't threaten her livelihood, but who could help her maintain the illusion of normalcy long enough to keep working. Matthew Jackson kept appearing in her thoughts. He was new in town, which meant he didn't know everyone, wouldn't be part of the gossip networks. He needed help with reading and writing, which meant he understood the vulnerability of needing assistance. And there had been something in his voice, a kindness that made her think he might be trustworthy. It was a risk. Everything was a risk now. The next morning, Matthew Jackson appeared at the general store just after opening. Annabelle heard him talking with Mr. Murphy in the front, asking if Miss Bishop might have time to help him today. I'll ask, Mr. Murphy said, and appeared in her doorway. Mr. Jackson is back about that letter reading. Are you feeling better today? Yes, much better, Annabelle said. Please send him in. She heard Matthew enter and close the door softly behind him. For a long moment she sat with her hands folded on the table, gathering courage. Mr. Jackson, before we proceed, I need to be honest with you about something, but I need your word that what I tell you will remain in confidence. You have my word, Miss Bishop. She took a deep breath. My eyesight is failing. I can no longer read well enough to make out the words in your sister's letter. I can still write because my hands remember the shapes, but reading has become nearly impossible. The silence stretched between them. She waited for questions, for judgment, for him to leave, and tell Mr. Murphy that the seamstress was going blind. Instead, he said, "Thank you for telling me. That must have been difficult." The unexpected kindness in his voice brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them back. I need this job, Mr. Jackson. If people know I can't see properly, I'll lose everything. I understand. I have letters of my own I haven't been able to read, she continued, the words tumbling out now, and I know more will come. I write to my cousin regularly, and she writes back. I've been trying to figure out how to manage, but I haven't found a solution yet. Perhaps we could help each other, Matthew said slowly. I need someone to read my letters and write my replies. You need someone to read your letters. We could make an arrangement. Hope flickered in her chest. What sort of arrangement? I'll read your letters to you and you write mine for me. No money between us, just an exchange of services. And we both keep each other's confidence. It was exactly what she needed. But suspicion made her hesitate. Why would you agree to that? You'd be getting the worse end of the bargain. You could pay anyone 5 cents to write a letter. Maybe I appreciate knowing someone who understands what it's like to need help, he said quietly. And maybe I'd rather work with someone I can trust to keep my business private. Man gets teased some in a mining camp for not being able to read or write. She understood that. Pride and shame came in many forms. "All right," she said, "we have an agreement." She heard him shift, then the rustle of paper. "Should I start with Ruth's letter?" "Please." His voice filled the small workroom as he read, and Annabelle closed her eyes, letting the words paint pictures in her mind. Ruth wrote about their younger brother starting school, about the early snow in Colorado, about missing Matthew and hoping he was eating properly. It was ordinary news, but Matthew's voice carried affection and homesickness that made the simple words meaningful. When he finished, there was a comfortable silence. "Would you like me to write a reply?" Annabelle asked. "Is not today. I need to think about what I want to say, but thank you." "I have 2 letters I need read," she said. "If you have time. All the time you need." She retrieved the letters from her apron pocket and handed them to him. He opened the first one from her cousin Margaret in San Francisco and began to read. Margaret wrote about the city, about the new dress shop where she worked, about a man who'd been courting her. Then her tone shifted. "I worry about you out there alone, Annabelle," Matthew read. "Have you seen a doctor about your eyes? There might be treatments, or at least answers about what's causing the problem. Please don't let pride or fear stop you from seeking help. I have a little money saved if you need it for medical care." Annabelle's throat tightened. Dear Margaret, always worrying, always trying to help despite having little enough herself. The second letter was from the fabric supplier confirming an order she'd placed weeks ago when she could still see well enough to work with new fabrics. She'd have to cancel it somehow. "Thank you, Mr. Jackson," she said when he'd finished. "I should get back to my mending now." "Matthew," he said, "if we're going to be helping each other, you might as well call me Matthew." "Then you should call me Annabelle." She heard him stand and move toward the door, then pause. "Annabelle, your cousin is right about seeing a doctor." "I know," she said quietly, "but doctors cost money I don't have. And even if I had it, I doubt there's much that can be done. I just need to manage as best I can for as long as I can." "Well, if you need anything else, you know where to find me. I'm at the Carson boarding house on the east side." After he left, Annabelle sat thinking about their arrangement, about the relief of sharing her secret with someone, about the sound of his voice reading Margaret's words. It had felt intimate, having him read her personal letters, but also comforting. She wasn't alone in this anymore. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. i.e. Matthew would come by the general store every few days, sometimes with letters from Ruth, sometimes with other correspondence he needed help with. He'd read Annabelle's letters to her, and she'd write his replies. They began to talk while they worked, sharing stories about their lives in the easy way of people who'd already shared their vulnerabilities. Annabelle learned that Matthew was 26, that he'd left Colorado after his father died to find better work to support his mother and siblings. He'd worked in mines in 3 different states, sending money home whenever he could. He was patient and thoughtful, never rushing her when she wrote his letters, never making her feel inadequate for needing his help. Matthew learned that Annabelle had come to Humboldt 3 years ago after both her parents died of fever, that her only living relative was Margaret, and that she'd built a quiet life here through sheer determination. He noticed how she navigated her workroom with increasing confidence, how her fingers could identify fabric types and button sizes by touch, how she never complained despite the frustration her condition must cause. One afternoon in late October, Matthew arrived with excitement in his voice. "Ruth is getting married," he announced. "She wants me to come back for the wedding, but it's in December and I can't afford to miss that much work. I need to write her a proper letter, something special." Annabelle smiled, caught up in his happiness. "Tell me about her fiancé." As Matthew talked about the man Ruth was marrying, a farmer's son she'd known since childhood, Annabelle wrote, crafting his thoughts into elegant sentences. She added small flourishes, expressions of joy and regret at not being able to attend, wishes for their happiness. When she finished, she handed him the letter. "Would you read it back to me?" Matthew asked. "I want to make sure it sounds right." Annabelle opened her mouth to refuse, then caught herself. She couldn't read it. But she couldn't admit that to Matthew, could she? Except she already had. He knew about her eyes. "I can't," she said softly. "I wrote it, but I can't read it back." "I know," Matthew said gently. I was asking if you'd let me read it to you so you could tell me if it sounds how I meant it to sound. Understanding washed over her, and with it, gratitude. He was including her, making her part of the process despite her limitations. Matthew read the letter aloud, and Annabelle listened critically, suggesting a word change here, a rephrasing there. Together they refined it until he was satisfied. You have a gift for this, Rasul, Matthew said. Ruth's going to think I suddenly became educated. You are educated, Annabelle countered. Not being able to read and write doesn't mean you lack intelligence or knowledge. You know mining, geology, how to survive in difficult conditions. That's education too. I suppose, he said. But there's power in words on paper. My father couldn't read either. And he was cheated more than once by men who could, men who made him sign things he didn't understand. That's part of why I want to learn, so I'm not at someone else's mercy. I could teach you, Annabelle said impulsively. I mean, I can't see to point out letters anymore, but I could make large letters you could feel, teach you the shapes and sounds. It would be slow, but it's possible. You'd do that? We're helping each other, aren't we? Besides, I think I'd enjoy it. I miss teaching. You were a teacher? Not officially, but I helped some of the other children learn when I was younger, before my parents died. I liked it. They started the next day. Annabelle cut letters from heavy cardboard, making them large enough for Matthew's fingers to trace. She guided his hand over each shape, teaching him the sounds, helping him understand how letters combined into words. He was a dedicated student practicing during his limited free time, asking questions, slowly building a foundation. As autumn deepened into winter, their arrangement evolved into something more than a simple exchange of services. They began to look forward to their time together, to linger over conversations after the letters were read and written. Annabelle found herself listening for Matthew's footsteps in the front of the store, her heart lifting when he appeared. Matthew found excuses to visit even when he had no letters, bringing her things he thought she might like: a ribbon he'd won at a church raffle, a piece of hard candy from the mercantile. The first time he took her hand to guide it over a letter shape, both of them felt the spark of awareness that had nothing to do with education. They'd been sitting close at her work table, and when their fingers touched, Matthew forgot what he was going to say. Annabelle felt heat rush to her face. Sorry, Matthew said, not sounding sorry at all. It's all right, Annabelle whispered. Neither of them pulled away immediately. It was Annabelle who finally acknowledged what was growing between them. They were in her workroom on a cold November afternoon, the stove radiating warmth, soft snow falling outside the window she could no longer see through. Matthew had just finished reading a letter from Margaret, who was definitely going to marry her suitor in the spring, and wanted Annabelle to come to San Francisco for the wedding. I'd like to go, Annabelle said wistfully, but I don't know if I can manage the journey alone, and I certainly can't afford to lose weeks of work. I'd go with you, Matthew said quietly. If you wanted company. The offer hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Traveling together would raise eyebrows, damage her reputation unless they were married or family. Matthew, she began, not sure what she wanted to say. I know it's not appropriate, he said quickly. I just meant if you needed someone, I'd find a way. Maybe we could say we're siblings or something. We look nothing alike. Cousins, then. She smiled despite her uncertainty. That's kind of you, but I think Margaret will have to manage without me. Or, Matthew said, his voice careful, we could go as husband and wife. For real, I mean, if that's something you might want. Annabelle's breath caught. Her heart hammered so hard she was sure he could hear it. Are you asking me to marry you? I'm doing a terrible job of it if you have to ask, Matthew said, and she heard him shift, moving closer. Annabelle, I know we haven't known each other long, but these past few months with you have been the best I've had in years. You're smart and kind and braver than anyone I've ever met. I admire you more than I can say. And somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you. Tears spilled down Annabelle's cheeks. I'm going blind, Matthew. Eventually I won't be able to work at all. Won't be able to take care of myself properly. You'd be taking on a burden. You're not a burden, he said fiercely. You're the woman I love. We'll figure out the rest together. I make decent money at the mine, enough to support us both. And you could still do some sewing, still write letters for people, still teach. Your eyes don't define everything you are." "I'm afraid," she whispered, "afraid of being helpless, of depending on someone, of being a disappointment." "I'm afraid too," Matthew admitted. "Afraid you'll say no, afraid I'm not good enough for you, afraid I can't give you the life you deserve. But I know I want to try. I know I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I know I want to be the person who reads to you and learns to write with you and figures out how to navigate whatever comes next. If you'll have me." Annabelle reached out, her hand finding his chest, feeling his heart beating as fast as her own. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Matthew's arms came around her, pulling her close, and she felt his lips press against her forehead, her cheeks finally finding her mouth in a kiss that tasted of hope and promise, and the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church, with Mr. Murphy and Mrs. Patterson as witnesses. Annabelle wore a simple blue dress she'd made herself years ago, and Matthew wore his only suit, brushed clean of mining dust. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and when Matthew kissed her, Annabelle felt the last of her fear dissolve into joy. They moved into a small house on the outskirts of Humboldt, a 2-room structure Matthew had been renting that now became their home. Annabelle memorized every corner, every piece of furniture, creating a mental map that let her move freely. Matthew built her a workshop with a large window for maximum light, and she continued taking in sewing and mending, though now she could be honest with customers about her limitations, referring them elsewhere for fine detail work she could no longer manage. True to his word, Matthew read to her every evening, not just letters now, but books borrowed from the church library and the occasional newspaper. His reading improved steadily under her tutelage, and Annabelle felt proud watching him slowly master the skill he'd wanted for so long. She continued to write letters for him and for others who sought her services, her penmanship still beautiful despite her blindness, her fingers remembering what her eyes couldn't see. Winter settled over Humboldt with surprising gentleness. The snows were light that year, and Matthew came home each evening from the mine tired but not exhausted, his mood better than it had been before their marriage. He'd talk about his day while Annabelle prepared dinner, telling her about the men he worked with, the progress of the mining operation, small dramas and triumphs underground. One evening in January, Matthew came home with unusual excitement in his voice. "I need you to write a letter to Ruth," he said, sweeping Annabelle into his arms and spinning her around. "I got promoted to shift supervisor. It means better pay and fewer hours underground." Annabelle laughed, dizzy from the spinning and his enthusiasm. "That's wonderful. Tell me everything." They sat together at the kitchen table, and Matthew dictated his news while Annabelle wrote. But this time, when she finished, she added her own paragraph at the end, introducing herself properly to Ruth for the first time, telling her how happy she was to be Matthew's wife, expressing hope that they might meet someday soon. Ruth's reply came 3 weeks later, warm and welcoming, addressing both of them. Matthew read it aloud while they sat by the fire, Annabelle leaning against him, content in a way she'd never imagined possible 6 months ago. "She says she wants us to visit after she's settled into married life," Matthew reported. "Says there's plenty of room and she's dying to meet you." "I'd like that," Annabelle said. "I'd like to meet her too, and your mother and brother." "We'll plan on it for spring then. The mine usually slows a bit in April, and I could probably get a week away." They fell into comfortable silence, Matthew's fingers absently stroking Annabelle's hair. She felt safe here, cherished, part of something bigger than her own struggles. She still couldn't see, still had moments of frustration and grief for what she'd lost, but Matthew's presence made it bearable. More than bearable, it made life rich and full in ways she hadn't expected. "Read to me from that book we started last week," she said, "the one about the sea voyage." Matthew reached for the book on the side table and opened it, finding their place. His voice washed over her, painting pictures with words, taking her to distant oceans she'd never see with her eyes, but could imagine perfectly in her mind. As winter gave way to early spring, life settled into pleasant rhythms. Annabelle's reputation as a letter writer grew, and she found herself with regular clients beyond just Matthew. Minors would come by in the evenings, bashful and hopeful, asking her to help them write to sweethearts or family back home. She charged modest fees and enjoyed the work, enjoying being useful in this new way. Matthew continued his lessons, and by March he could read simple sentences and write his own name clearly. They celebrated his progress with a special dinner, and Annabelle felt enormous pride in his achievement. She knew how hard he'd worked, how much courage it took to admit he needed to learn and then to do the difficult work of learning. One afternoon in early April, as Annabelle was finishing a mending job, she heard an unfamiliar commotion outside, shouting, running footsteps, a sense of urgency that made her stomach clench. She set down her work and moved to the door, straining to understand what was happening. "Mrs. Jackson," a young voice, breathless. "Mrs. Jackson, are you home?" She opened the door. "I'm here. What's wrong?" "It's the mine, madam. There's been a collapse. They're bringing up injured men." Terror flooded through her. "My husband?" "Don't know yet, madam. They're still digging. I'm supposed to tell all the wives to come to the mine office." Annabelle's hands shook as she grabbed her shawl. "Can you walk me there? I can't see well enough to run." "Yes, madam, take my arm." The boy, probably no more than 12, guided her through the streets toward the mine. Annabelle could hear other women crying, praying, calling out for news. The walk felt endless, each step weighted with dread. Matthew was a supervisor now, she reminded herself. He spent less time underground. Maybe he'd been in the office. Maybe he was safe. At the mine, chaos reigned. Men shouted orders, equipment clanked and groaned, and the metallic smell of dust and fear hung heavy in the air. Annabelle stood with the other wives, holding herself rigid, waiting for news. "Matthew Jackson?" she asked anyone who passed. "Has anyone seen Matthew Jackson?" No one had answers, or if they did, they were too busy to stop. An hour passed, then 2. Some men emerged from the mine, injured but alive. Annabelle listened to the names being called, her heart sinking each time Matthews wasn't among them. Finally, someone touched her arm. "Mrs. Jackson? Your husband is coming up now. He's injured but alive." Relief nearly drove her to her knees. "How badly?" "Don't know yet. The doctor's looking at him." She let someone guide her to the medical tent that had been hastily erected. Inside, men groaned in pain, and she could smell blood and sweat and fear. She called Matthew's name, her voice breaking. "Here, Annabelle, I'm here." She followed his voice, found him sitting on a cot. Her hands went to his face, his shoulders, his arms, checking for injuries by touch. His left arm was bandaged, and she felt him wince when she touched his ribs. What happened? "Support beam gave way in one of the tunnels," Matthew said, his voice tight with pain. "Caught a few men underneath. I was helping dig them out when more rock came down, broke my arm and maybe cracked a rib or two, but I'm alive. We all got out." "Thank God," Annabelle whispered, pressing her forehead against his. "Thank God you're safe." They sat together while the doctor worked on other, more seriously injured men. Eventually, he came to splint Matthew's arm properly and wrap his ribs. He prescribed rest and light duty for at least 6 weeks. "You're lucky," the doctor said gruffly, "and could have been much worse." Lucky? Yes, they were lucky. 3 men had died in the collapse, Annabelle learned later. 3 families who wouldn't have happy reunions, who would face futures without their providers. She ached for them even as she thanked God her own husband had been spared. The next weeks were challenging. Matthew couldn't work, which meant no income, and with his injuries he needed care. Annabelle struggled to provide with her limited vision. But neighbors helped, bringing food and offering assistance. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house came by daily to check on them. Mr. Murphy extended credit at the store. The community that Annabelle had always kept at arm's length, afraid of their judgment, now surrounded her with kindness. Matthew's recovery was slow but steady. His arm healed straight, his ribs stopped aching, and by mid-May he was cleared to return to light supervisory duties. The mine owners, shaken by the accident, had implemented new safety measures and were being more cautious about where they dug. Matthew threw himself into his work with renewed purpose, determined to keep his men safe. During those weeks of recovery, something shifted in their marriage. The crisis had tested them and found them strong. They'd learned to depend on each other completely, to communicate without words, to find comfort in simple presence. Annabelle had discovered she could care for an injured husband despite her blindness, and Matthew had learned to accept help without feeling diminished. One evening in late May, as they sat on their small porch watching the sunset, or rather, as Matthew watched and described it to Annabelle, he said, "I've been thinking about that trip to visit Ruth." "You're well enough to travel now," Annabelle agreed. "The mine could spare you for a week or two." "I was thinking we might stay longer, maybe even look for work near my family instead of here." Annabelle turned toward him, surprised. "You want to leave Humboldt?" "After the collapse, I've been thinking about what matters. Family matters. Being close to people we love matters. Ruth's married now, starting her own family. My brother's getting older. Ma's not getting any younger. And here it's just us. No family, dangerous work. Maybe there's something better out there. But your job here is good now. And we have this house, and I have my sewing clients. You could have sewing clients anywhere, and I could find work anywhere. But family, we only have one of. I don't want to wake up 10 years from now regretting that I spent all that time far away from them." Annabelle understood the pull of family, the loneliness of being separated from the people who'd known you longest. "What's in Colorado for work?" "Ranching mostly, some mining still, but also farming cattle. Different kind of life. Harder in some ways, but maybe better too." "You'd be happy on a ranch?" "I think I might be. I think we both might be. Open spaces, animals, land of our own eventually. Seems like it could be a good life." Annabelle thought about it, turning the idea over in her mind. Leaving Humboldt meant leaving the familiar, the geography she'd memorized, the routines she'd established. But it also meant family, support, new possibilities. And ultimately, home wasn't a place anymore. It was Matthew. Wherever he was, that's where she belonged. "All right," she said, "let's go to Colorado." They spent the next month preparing. Matthew gave notice at the mine, and they sold what furniture they couldn't take with them. Annabelle finished all her pending sewing jobs and wrote letters to her regular clients explaining she was moving. Mr. Murphy threw them a small farewell party at the store, and Annabelle was touched by how many people came, how many expressed sadness at their leaving. The journey to Colorado took nearly 2 weeks, traveling first by stage and then by train. It was Annabelle's first time on a train, and she loved the rhythm of it, the speed, the sense of moving towards something new. Matthew described everything to her: the changing landscape, the mountains rising in the distance, the small towns they passed through. Other passengers sometimes gave them curious looks, noticing how Matthew guided Annabelle, how she moved carefully, but no one commented. Ruth met them at the station in a small town called Silverdale, throwing herself into Matthew's arms with joyful tears. She was shorter than Annabelle had imagined, with a loud, warm laugh and a voice that carried genuine affection when she turned to embrace Annabelle. "I'm so happy to finally meet you," Ruth said. "Matthew's letters have been so full of you that I feel like I know you already." "I've been looking forward to meeting you too," Annabelle said. "Thank you for having us." Ruth's husband James was quieter, but friendly, and he helped load their bags into a wagon. They drove out to the farm where Ruth and James lived, a small but prosperous-looking operation with fields of crops and a sizable herd of cattle. The house was larger than what Annabelle and Matthew had left behind, with a wide porch and the smell of bread baking. Matthew's mother, Sarah, was waiting at the house, along with his 14-year-old brother, Thomas. There were more tearful reunions, more embraces, and Annabelle felt herself welcomed into this family with an ease that made her throat tight. These people loved Matthew, and because they loved him, they were ready to love her too. The first few days were overwhelming, meeting neighbors, learning the layout of Ruth's house, adjusting to the altitude and the different quality of light. But gradually, Annabelle found her footing. Ruth was patient, describing things carefully, helping Annabelle navigate without making her feel helpless. Sarah treated her like a daughter, not a stranger. Even young Thomas seemed to accept her presence without question. Matthew looked happier than Annabelle had ever seen him. Being near his family clearly filled something in him that had been empty. He helped James with work around the farm, talking with his brother about ranching, spending long evenings catching up with his mother. And every night he came to Annabelle with stories about his day, descriptions of what he'd seen, expressions of gratitude that she'd agreed to come here. 2 weeks into their visit, James mentioned that the neighboring ranch was for sale. The owner had died, and his widow was moving back east to live with her daughter. It was a small operation, about 60 acres, with a modest house and barn, some cattle, and good water rights. "Might be worth looking at if you're serious about staying," James said to Matthew. "Good land, fair price. We could help you get started." Matthew and Annabelle talked about it late into the night. Did they dare? Could they manage a ranch? Matthew had experience with hard physical work, but not with ranching specifically. Annabelle could contribute some domestic skills, but would need help with anything requiring good vision. It seemed ambitious, maybe foolish, but it also felt right. The idea of having their own land, building something together, putting down real roots. Ruth and James would be nearby for help and company. Matthew's mother and brother could visit easily. It was everything Matthew had imagined when he'd suggested leaving Nevada. "Let's at least look at it," Annabelle said. The next day, James drove them to the neighboring ranch. Matthew described everything to Annabelle as they walked the property, the house that needed some repairs but was structurally sound, the barn with its good strong beams, the creek running through the back pasture, the mountains visible in the distance. The cattle were thin but healthy, and there were chickens in a coop and 2 decent horses in the corral. "What do you think?" Matthew asked Annabelle when they were alone on the porch of the empty house. "I think it sounds beautiful. I think it sounds like hard work. I think it sounds like home." "I think so too." They made an offer the next day, using all their savings as a down payment. The widow accepted, grateful to have the matter settled quickly, and within a month, the ranch was theirs. Matthew and Annabelle Jackson, ranchers in Colorado, starting a new life together. The first year was brutally hard. Matthew had to learn ranching from scratch, leaning heavily on James's expertise. There were disasters: a fence that broke and let half the herd wander off, a barn roof that leaked and ruined hay stores, chickens killed by foxes. Money was tight, tighter than it had ever been in Nevada. Some days Matthew came home so exhausted he could barely eat dinner before falling asleep. Some days Annabelle felt so frustrated by her limitations, by the things she couldn't do, that she wanted to scream. But there were also unexpected joys. The feel of sun on Annabelle's face as she sat on the porch, shelling peas. The satisfaction of collecting eggs from hens she couldn't see but could hear and feel. The pleasure of making bread in her own kitchen, of hanging laundry on her own line, of belonging somewhere completely. Matthew's pride when he sold his first cattle at a decent price. The companionship of Ruth's frequent visits. The sweetness of falling into bed exhausted but together, knowing they'd built all of this themselves. Annabelle continued writing letters, her reputation spreading through the community. Women came to her for help writing difficult letters, notifications of death, requests for help, love letters to distant husbands. Men came for business correspondence, contracts, formal documents. She became known as the blind letter writer, and people marveled at her perfect penmanship and thoughtful phrasing. The small income helped, but more importantly, it gave Annabelle a sense of purpose beyond just household work. Matthew continued learning to read and write, practicing every evening with Annabelle's patient guidance. By their second anniversary, he could read entire books to her without stumbling, and his handwriting while never as beautiful as hers, was clear and functional. He kept ledgers for the ranch, wrote his own letters sometimes, even read the occasional newspaper. The skill that had seemed impossible 2 years ago was now simply part of who he was. In the spring of their 3rd year in Colorado, Annabelle realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with equal parts joy and terror. How would she manage a baby when she couldn't see? How would she keep a child safe when she couldn't watch them? What if something went wrong and she couldn't tell? Matthew's response was characteristically calm. "We'll figure it out, just like we figured everything else out. You're going to be a wonderful mother." "How can you be so sure?" "Because you're patient and smart, and you don't let obstacles stop you, because you've already adapted to more difficult things than this, because I've watched you do impossible things for 3 years now, and I know you can do this too." His confidence steadied her, and as her pregnancy progressed, Annabelle found that he was right. She prepared the nursery by touch, sewing tiny clothes, arranging furniture in configurations she memorized. Ruth and Sarah visited often, offering advice and assistance. The community rallied around her, women stopping by to check on her, offering to help when the baby came. In November, Annabelle gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She couldn't see his face, but her hands learned every inch of him, the shape of his nose, the curve of his ears, the feel of his fingers wrapping around hers. They named him Thomas, after Matthew's brother, and his cries filled their small house with new life. Matthew proved to be a devoted father, describing their son to Annabelle constantly. "He has your mouth," he'd say, "your stubborn chin, my eyes, I think, but your coloring." He'd place the baby in her arms and guide her hands to show her how Thomas was growing, changing, developing. Annabelle learned to care for Thomas by touch and sound, her other senses compensating for her lack of sight. She could tell by his cries whether he was hungry, tired, uncomfortable, or just wanting attention. She could change his clothes and diapers, bathe him, rock him to sleep. When he began to crawl and then walk, Matthew baby proofed the house and described Thomas's location constantly so Annabelle could track him. As Thomas grew, he learned that Mama couldn't see like other people, but to him it was simply a fact of life, no more remarkable than the fact that the sky was blue or cows gave milk. He learned to tell Annabelle where he was, what he was doing, what he wanted. He became her eyes in many ways, describing the world to her with increasing sophistication as his vocabulary grew. The ranch prospered slowly but steadily. Matthew proved to be a natural rancher, patient with animals and willing to put in the grinding daily work required. They expanded their herd, improved their pastures, built new outbuildings. After 5 years, they were not just surviving but actually thriving, with money in the bank and plans for the future. Annabelle's letter-writing business continued to grow. She hired a local teenager to help with deliveries and to read her any letters that required responses. She began offering lessons to adults who wanted to learn to write better, holding classes in her parlor on Sunday afternoons. Her students included ranch hands, miners, shopkeepers, anyone who felt their lack of education and wanted to improve. She charged modest fees, using the money to buy books and supplies. Matthew would often sit in on these lessons, both to help and to continue his own education. His reading was now nearly fluent, and he developed a particular love of history and biography. He and Annabelle would discuss the books they read, debating ideas and sharing insights. These conversations became highlights of their days, intellectual companionship that deepened their bond. When Thomas was 3, Annabelle became pregnant again. This time, having been through it once, she felt more confident. Their daughter, Margaret, named after Annabelle's cousin, was born in the spring in an easy delivery. She was a quieter baby than Thomas had been, more contemplative, and Annabelle delighted in learning the unique feel of this new child. Margaret grew into a serious, thoughtful little girl who seemed to understand her mother's limitations instinctively and worked around them without being asked. By the time she was 4, she was describing things to Annabelle with impressive detail, pointing out colors and shapes and changes in the world around them. Life settled into a comfortable pattern. The ranch work was still hard, but no longer overwhelming. Thomas started school in town, riding in with Matthew when he went to sell cattle or buy supplies. Margaret helped Annabelle in the house, learning to cook and clean and sew. They had Sunday dinners with Ruth and James and their growing family, the houses full of children and laughter. One evening, when Annabelle was 32 and had been married to Matthew for 9 years, they sat together on their porch as the sun set. Thomas and Margaret were playing in the yard, their voices carrying on the warm summer air. Matthew held Annabelle's hand, his thumb tracing lazy circles on her palm. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Just marrying me, coming here, all of this?" "Never," Annabelle said without hesitation. "Do you?" "Not for a second. I was just thinking about how different my life might have been if I hadn't walked into Murphy's store that day and needed a letter written, if I hadn't been brave enough to offer to help you." "I think about that too sometimes. I was so scared back then, so alone. I thought losing my sight meant losing everything. Instead, you gained everything." "We gained everything," she corrected. Together. Matthew pulled her close, and Annabelle rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the sounds of their children playing. The cattle lowing in the distance, the wind through the grass. She couldn't see any of it, would never see her husband's face or her children's smiles or the mountains she knew stood majestic on the horizon. But she had something more valuable than sight. She had love, family, purpose, and a life richer than anything she'd imagined in those dark days when her vision first began to fail. "Tell me about the sunset," she said, as she had countless times before. Matthew's voice washed over her, describing the colors, the way light painted the clouds, how the mountains stood silhouetted against the glowing sky. His words created pictures in her mind more beautiful than anything her failing eyes had ever shown her. When he finished, they sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, watching their children play, Matthew with his eyes, Annabelle with her heart. The future stretched before them, unknown but not frightening, because whatever came, they would face it together. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Thomas grew tall and strong, eventually taking over much of the heavy work from Matthew, who was beginning to feel his years of hard labor in his joints and back. Margaret showed her mother's talent for words, becoming an accomplished writer who helped Annabelle with her letter-writing business and eventually took it over completely, expanding it to include a small book lending library in their front parlor. More children came, 2 more boys and another girl, over the next decade. The house expanded to accommodate the growing family with additions built by Matthew and Thomas and later James's sons. The ranch prospered beyond their early dreams, becoming one of the most successful in the region. Matthew served on the school board and helped found a library in town. Annabelle's teaching expanded to include younger children, and she became known throughout the county as the woman who could teach anyone to read and write, no matter their age or background. When Thomas was 22, he married a girl from town, and they built a house on the far corner of the ranch property. When he brought his first child to meet Annabelle, placing the tiny baby in her arms, she felt the circle completing. She was a grandmother now, her hands learning a new generation. Margaret married at 20, a scholar who'd studied at a teacher's college in Denver, and she brought her husband back to help run the ranch and the expanding educational enterprise. The younger children were still at home, filling the house with energy and noise and life. Matthew's hair went white and his face grew lined, but to Annabelle's hands he was still the same man who'd offered to read her letters in a dusty workroom in Nevada decades ago. They still read together every evening, still talked about ideas and dreams, still found comfort and joy in simple companionship. Ruth and James remained close neighbors and dear friends. Sarah lived to see her grandchildren grown, passing peacefully in her sleep at 78. The community they'd become part of continued to support and embrace them, never treating Annabelle's blindness as a limitation, but simply as a characteristic, like the color of her hair or the sound of her voice. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Matthew arranged a surprise party. The house was full of family and friends, people whose lives Annabelle and Matthew had touched over the years. There were miners from Humboldt who'd traveled all that way to attend. There were former students who credited Annabelle with changing their lives by teaching them to read. There were neighbors who'd become family. Children who'd grown up knowing Aunt Annabelle as the lady who couldn't see but somehow saw everything that mattered. As Matthew guided her through the crowd, introducing her to people she recognized by voice and touch, Annabelle felt overwhelmed by gratitude. This life, this rich, full, joyful life, had grown from what she'd once seen as her greatest tragedy. Losing her sight had led her to Matthew, had taught her resilience and creativity, had opened doors she'd never known existed. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had left and only family remained, Matthew led Annabelle to their porch, their favorite place to sit and talk and be together. "I have something for you," he said. "Close your eyes." She laughed. "That seems redundant. Just humor me." She heard the rustle of paper, and then Matthew placed something in her hands. A book, bound in leather, heavy and substantial. "What is this?" "It's us," Matthew said softly. "Our story. I've been writing it for the past year with Margaret's help. Every letter we ever wrote, every important moment, everything I wanted to remember, I had it bound properly, made it official. Our story. Preserved." Annabelle's hands traced the cover, feeling the embossed letters she couldn't read. "What does it say on the cover?" "It says, 'The Letters of Annabelle and Matthew Jackson, a love story in words and faith.'" Tears spilled down Annabelle's cheeks. "Will you read some of it to me?" "All of it if you want, every single word." Matthew opened the book and began to read, his voice carrying the same warmth and steadiness that had first drawn Annabelle to him all those years ago. He read about a frightened woman losing her sight, about a man who couldn't read reaching out in kindness, about two people finding each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and building something beautiful together. As Matthew's voice washed over her, Annabelle realized that this was what they'd been doing from the very beginning, creating a story together, one word at a time, one letter at a time, one day at a time. A story that continued to unfold with each sunrise, with each child and grandchild, with each moment of companionship and love. The next years brought their own challenges and joys. Matthew's health began to decline slowly, nothing dramatic, but the steady wearing down of a body that had worked hard for 7 decades. Annabelle, by contrast, remained vigorous, her blindness now such a long-standing condition that she'd adapted to it so completely that sometimes people forgot she couldn't see. They traveled some in those later years, taking the train to San Francisco to visit Margaret's cousin, who was now a prosperous businesswoman. They went back to Humboldt once, walking the streets of the town where they'd met, visiting the spot where Murphy's general store had stood before burning down in a fire. Everything had changed, yet the memories were as vivid as ever. Thomas took over full operation of the ranch, proving himself a capable and innovative manager. Margaret's library and teaching practice flourished, expanding to serve 3 counties. The younger children found their own paths. One became a doctor, another a lawyer, one ran a successful freight business. They all stayed in Colorado, drawn by the land and the family ties that bound them. When Matthew was 73 and Annabelle 68, they celebrated their 42nd wedding anniversary quietly, just the two of them on their porch, as they'd celebrated so many evenings throughout their marriage. Matthew's hands shook slightly now when he held a book, and his voice was thinner, but he still read to Annabelle every night, still told her about the world beyond what she could touch. "Do you remember that first letter I asked you to write?" Matthew asked that evening. "To Ruth? Telling her I'd found work in Nevada?" "I remember being terrified I'd make mistakes, that you'd see how poorly I was writing without being able to see the words. Your handwriting was perfect, it always was, and now you do all your own writing. Only because you taught me, only because you saw something in me worth teaching. I saw a man willing to help someone, even when it cost him something. I saw kindness and courage. That's what I fell in love with." "I fell in love with your strength," Matthew said. Your refusal to let circumstances defeat you, your grace under pressure. You were the bravest person I'd ever met. We were good for each other. We still are. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set. Matthew describing the colors as he always did, creating pictures with words as he'd done for more than 4 decades. When the stars came out, he described those too, painting the night sky with language, giving Annabelle the universe through his eyes. Matthew lived 5 more years, healthy and active, until the very end, when his heart simply stopped one night while he slept beside Annabelle. She woke to stillness, reached for him and found him cold, and knew immediately that he was gone. The grief was crushing, a physical pain in her chest that made breathing difficult. But even through the sorrow, she was grateful. 47 years together. 47 years of love and partnership, of shared dreams and daily kindnesses. Not everyone got that. The funeral was enormous, people coming from across the state to pay respects to a man who'd been admired and loved by so many. Annabelle sat through it with her children and grandchildren around her, listening to stories about Matthew that made her proud and sad in equal measure. In the years after Matthew's death, Annabelle continued living on the ranch, cared for by her children, but still fiercely independent in many ways. She still wrote letters for people occasionally, though her hands grew shakier with age. She still taught reading to anyone who wanted to learn, adapting her methods for her own increasing frailty. Margaret read to her now in the evenings, taking on the role Matthew had fulfilled for so long. They worked through book after book, and sometimes Margaret would read from the book Matthew had written, the story of their parents' love, and Annabelle would add details and corrections, keeping the history accurate and alive. Grandchildren became great-grandchildren. The ranch continued to prosper under Thomas's management, and later under his sons. The world changed dramatically. Electricity came, then telephones, then automobiles. Annabelle experienced it all through description and touch, always curious, always engaged. She lived to be 87 years old, remarkably healthy, until nearly the end. When she finally passed peacefully in her sleep like Matthew had, it was surrounded by 3 generations of family in the house she and Matthew had built together. At her funeral, her eldest great-grandson read from Matthew's book, telling the story of how 2 people who needed each other had found each other in a dusty Nevada town, how they'd built a life together through love and faith and daily acts of kindness. He read about letters written and read about trust and partnership, about 2 people who'd proven that limitations were only as powerful as you allowed them to be. After the service, the family gathered on the porch that Annabelle and Matthew had loved so much. The house was full of their descendants. Dozens of people who existed because 2 people had been brave enough to help each other, to love each other, to build something beautiful together. She never considered herself disabled, Margaret said to her own daughter. She always said she just had to do things differently, but the doing was still possible. Grandpa said that when he met her, he thought she was the strongest person he'd ever known, one of the grandchildren added. He said watching her work despite her failing eyesight taught him that limitations were often just excuses. They taught each other, Thomas said quietly. She taught him to read and write. He taught her to see the world in new ways. They were partners in the truest sense. The sun was setting, painting the Colorado sky in brilliant colors that Annabelle had never seen but had experienced through Matthew's words for 47 years. The ranch stretched out around them, the land they'd built together, the legacy they'd left behind. In the parlor, the book Matthew had written sat on a special shelf, its leather cover worn from decades of reading. Beside it were journals kept by their children and grandchildren, continuing the story, documenting how one act of kindness in a general store in 1882 had rippled forward through generations, creating a family defined not by what they couldn't do, but by what they chose to build together. The letters were there too, preserved carefully, the ones Matthew had dictated and Annabelle had written, the ones others had sent, and Matthew had read aloud. Physical evidence of communication and connection, of two people who'd bridged their different challenges to create something neither could have achieved alone. As darkness fell and the family began to drift inside, one of the youngest great-grandchildren asked her mother, what was so special about Grandma Annabelle and Grandpa Matthew? Her mother smiled, thinking about how to explain a love story that had shaped their entire family. They saw past the surface, she finally said. Grandpa couldn't read, so Grandma wrote for him. Grandma couldn't see, so Grandpa described the world to her. They filled in each other's gaps and made each other complete, and they taught all of us that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone whose imperfections fit with yours, someone who makes you want to be better and braver and kinder. Did they ever regret it? Getting married when they had so many challenges? Never. Not once. They used to say they were lucky to have found each other, that their challenges brought them together, and their love helped them overcome anything else. Grandma would say that losing her sight was the worst and best thing that ever happened to her, because it led her to Grandpa. The little girl thought about this, then nodded as if it made perfect sense. And perhaps in the way of children, she understood something essential, that love wasn't about circumstances or abilities, or having everything figured out. It was about showing up for each other day after day, letter after letter, word after word, building something beautiful one moment at a time. Inside the house, someone lit the lamps, and warm light spilled onto the porch where Annabelle and Matthew had spent so many evenings together. The family drifted inside to share memories and stories, to eat and laugh and cry and celebrate two lives well lived and deeply intertwined. And if the old house seemed to hold an extra warmth that night, if the wind through the grass sounded almost like voices murmuring to each other, if the stars seemed particularly bright over the Colorado mountains, well, perhaps that was just the evening settling in, or perhaps it was the echo of a love story that had transcended all obstacles, proving that sometimes the things we think will break us are actually the things that lead us exactly where we need to be. The ranch continued on, generation after generation, always with copies of Matthew's book on the shelf, always with stories told about the blind seamstress and the cowboy who couldn't read, always with a reminder that love and partnership and daily acts of kindness could build legacies that lasted far beyond a single lifetime. Their story became part of the family's foundation, shaping how they approached challenges, how they treated each other, how they understood that true strength comes not from never needing help, but from having the courage to accept it and the grace to offer it in return. And somewhere in whatever comes after, two souls who had found each other against all odds were together still, Matthew describing the wonders of eternity while Annabelle painted them in words, their partnership continuing beyond the boundaries of mortal life, their love proving that some bonds transcend all limitations, even death itself. The story that began with failing eyesight and unread letters had become a testament to the transformative power of love, the strength found in vulnerability, and the beautiful truth that sometimes our greatest weaknesses lead us to our greatest blessings. Annabelle and Matthew Jackson had lived their truth fully, loved each other completely, and left behind a legacy that would continue to inspire their descendants for generations to come, a legacy built on simple acts of kindness, on reading and writing letters, on seeing each other truly despite physical limitations, and on choosing each day to build something beautiful together. Their love story, preserved in Matthew's book and in the memories of those who knew them, remained a beacon of hope and possibility, proving that no challenge is insurmountable when faced with love, that no limitation can constrain two hearts determined to find each other, and that the most profound seeing comes not from eyes, but from souls that recognize their perfect match even in the most unlikely circumstances. The end came peacefully for both of them, as it should for people who'd lived with such grace and purpose. But in truth, there was no end to what they'd created. The love they'd shared, the family they'd built, the lessons they'd taught, the example they'd set, all of it continued on, rippling forward through time, touching lives they'd never meet, inspiring stories they'd never hear, proving that two people who chose each other, who helped each other, who loved each other despite and because of their challenges, could create something that would last forever. And that, perhaps, was the greatest legacy of all.